I wasn't sure what drew me outside that night. It wasn't loneliness, though I'd become as familiar with that as one could be. The streets, usually filled with holiday cheer, were deserted, and an unnatural quietness blanketed the town. Even the snow fell soundlessly, a thin veil of white covering the curbs and lamp posts, and the occasional glimmer of Christmas lights seemed misplaced, like remnants of a forgotten celebration. Last Christmas, the world had still felt somewhat ordinary, or at least mine had. The memories were indistinct now, lost to a haze that seemed to hang over everything, obscuring reality and sealing it away. My son's face was becoming harder to picture, his laughter a memory blurred by time. The emptiness within me had deepened each passing day since I lost him, like some hollow echo that refused to fade. I hadn't opened his old winter coat until tonight, when I'd reached into the pocket and found his last letter to Santa. How it ended up there was beyond me. My mind offered no answers, just an empty silence as I read his childish scrawl, a wish for something as simple as a toy train. And so I'd left the house, driven by some pull I couldn't explain, the letter folded in my pocket. I thought I might find a small toy store still open, though the rational part of me knew that was impossible. A few days ago, they'd said the outbreak was spreading. First in distant cities, places I could detach from myself with little difficulty. But last night, the news had shown footage of towns not far from here, images of figures moving aimlessly in the snow. Yet tonight, there was no sign of any life or anything resembling it. Street after street was empty, shops dark and locked, as if the town had gone to sleep forever. I wasn't frightened, oddly enough. A calm, dreamlike quality washed over me as I passed familiar places now left to the dark, each one a memory disconnected from the present. Then I saw them, the first figures, standing still as statues on the sidewalk outside a bakery. Their limbs were slack, heads tilted in angles that seemed to defy anatomy. They looked almost peaceful, save for the faint frost clinging to their clothes. An elderly couple, two parents, a child barely older than my own. All of them stood as if caught in a moment of indecision, frozen not by the cold but by some inexplicable force. They were like decorations left out in the snow, quiet and lifeless. I kept my distance, every instinct urging me to turn back. But something about the quietness was strange. An absence of hostility, almost, as if they had no interest in me or in anything at all. I could hear faint music playing from a distance, muffled by the snow, a tune that sounded like it had been dragged from another world. It was familiar, yet twisted somehow like a Christmas carol gone wrong. I passed more figures, each one arranged as if by a deranged hand, some holding hands, others standing alone, and all silent in a way that gnawed at me. No breaths, no shuffles or groans. They simply existed, as still as the decorations in a holiday display, waiting for something I didn't want to understand. Ahead, a small shop's display caught my eye. Through the frosted glass, I could make out toys arranged on shelves, a Christmas tree in the corner, its lights dim and flickering. I hesitated before stepping toward the door, the letter pressing against my pocket like a reminder. As I reached the entrance, a handprint smudged in ash appeared on the window, small and delicate, as though a child had pressed their fingers there long ago. Couldn't look away. Inside, I thought I saw movement, a faint shifting, like shadows gathering in the dimness. But as I stepped back, the door creaked open, inviting me into the silence. I left the house under the hesitant light of dawn, feeling the crunch of snow underfoot as if it were amplified in the empty silence. The streets stretched out before me, barren and hauntingly decorated. Christmas lights still hung on every lamppost, wreaths adorned the doors, and plastic reindeer gazed out into the nothingness. Their red noses blinked on and off in the gathering daylight, offering a strange mockery of life. The wind tugged at my coat as I made my way down Main Street, each step seeming to echo back at me from the empty, shuttered windows. The snowfall had covered every inch of what was once bustling ground, but it was untouched, as though no one had ventured out in days. Yet there were signs, small, almost negligible signs, that life had once been here. A single mitten lay half-buried near a bench, and further down the street, a child's sled sat frozen mid-slide on the icy pavement. It was as if the town had simply paused in mid-celebration, caught in the lull between joy and dread. I clutched the letter tighter, a grounding weight in my pocket. Every few steps, my fingers would drift back to it, as if I needed to confirm it was still there. The words of my son, etched onto the paper, felt like a guide through this surreal tableau. He had wanted a toy train, something simple and whimsical, and it was that desire that kept my feet moving forward. I had to find that toy store, even if the thought seemed absurd now. As I rounded a corner, I caught my first sight of them, the silent figures standing motionless in the snow. They were scattered across the street like grotesque decorations themselves, blank eyes staring into the frost-covered ground. My pulse quickened, though I forced myself to keep moving, to ignore the way they lingered, lifeless yet somehow too present. I was almost past them when I noticed something unnerving. A man, wearing a red sweater and Santa hat, stood at the center of the street. His mouth was slightly open, his hands outstretched as if he'd been about to offer a greeting. His eyes, glazed and unfocused, were locked on the sky. Snow had gathered on his shoulders, his face, his open mouth, like some twisted holiday mask. He might have been a mannequin, had I not seen the frost glistening on his eyelashes. It was then that I realized that they all had the same blank expressions, their bodies at awkward angles, as if they had been interrupted mid-action. The woman by the lamppost, her hand raised as if waving goodbye. The child near the grocery store, reaching out to an invisible hand. And yet none of them moved. They stood like statues, frozen in place by some unspoken command. I forced myself to look away, to press on towards the toy shop. The faintest sound began to grow in the distance. A haunting tune, barely audible but unmistakable. It was Silent Night, only it was distorted, played on an off-key piano that made the melody grating, uncomfortable. It drifted through the cold air, winding through the empty streets, unsettling in its cheerfulness. The music seemed to wake them. A few heads turned in my direction, their vacant eyes finding focus. Slowly, as if reluctantly roused from slumber, they began to move. They were slow, their motions almost mechanical, and yet there was an undeniable grace to it, a strange choreography. They moved as if they were guided by that twisted, haunting melody. I felt my stomach tighten, and an impulse to run gripped me, but I was rooted to the spot, watching their unnatural procession. Some of them began to drift toward me, their limbs jerking slightly, as if testing the range of their own movement. The music grew louder, filling the air, and I realized it was coming from a speaker outside the town hall, playing on a loop, warped and skipping. I forced myself to keep walking, avoiding their gaze. But even as I walked past, I could feel their attention shift, their eyes following my every step. They didn't reach for me, didn't stumble into my path, but the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Finally, I reached the toy store, its windows frosted over, the lights within dimmed but still flickering. I pressed my hand against the glass, peering inside. The store was empty, shelves lined with toys left untouched. In the center stood a tree, tall and gaudily decorated, the ornaments casting strange reflections. Beneath it lay scattered envelopes, letters to Santa, abandoned in their rush to escape or their final surrender to despair. I pushed the door open, the bell above ringing out, oddly cheerful in the heavy silence. As I stepped inside, the soft tune of Silent Night reached even here, distant yet persistent. I scanned the room, searching for something, anything, that would feel like closure, like an answer to this madness. Then, amid the letters under the tree, I spotted it. A small box, wrapped in silver paper with a card attached. It had my son's name on it. My heart thudded as I knelt down to pick it up. I had no idea who could have left it here, no rational explanation. But in this strange town, in this twisted holiday landscape, reason had long since deserted me. Holding the package, I felt a surge of emotion, a grief so deep it took my breath away. Clutching it close, I realized that this small, silver-wrapped box was the only link I had left to him. As I turned to leave, the music faded, and for a brief moment, the town fell into a deeper silence. A silence so profound that it felt like it could swallow me whole. But as I stepped back out into the cold, the figures in the street had turned, facing me. They stood in perfect lines, like some perverse choir, waiting, expectant. The silence held for a beat, and then the music returned, stronger, louder, and with it came a collective shuffling, a sound that seemed to fill every corner of the street. They were coming toward me now, and I knew that I could run, but something inside me had shifted. I didn't flee. Instead, I held my son's letter and the small box close, the last remnants of a life I had lost, and waited as they drew closer, drawn to me by whatever dark command had summoned them into this quiet, twisted holiday dance. I should have run. Every instinct, every nerve told me to turn, to flee. But something about their slow, rhythmic approach held me still. The figures moved like shadows pulling free from the walls of a nightmare, swaying in time with that haunting, off-key rendition of Silent Night. They moved with eerie coordination, as if they were answering some unspoken summons, and I felt the weight of their attention settle over me, heavy and oppressive, like the air just before a storm. I tightened my grip on the small silver box and backed toward the toy shop door, my fingers fumbling against the cold metal of the handle. But when I glanced over my shoulder, I found the door had closed, the glass somehow coated in a layer of frost that hadn't been there moments before. It was as though the town itself wanted to keep me here, watching, among its frozen and faithful congregation. I forced myself to look back at the figures, now close enough that I could make out their faces in detail. The man in the Santa hat with his eerie, open mouth, the child with outstretched fingers frozen in mid-reach, the elderly woman bundled in layers of scarves, her eyes unnaturally wide, lips pursed in a soundless whisper. Each face bore the same expression, a mixture of sadness and longing, a profound grief that seemed to have seeped into their very bones. And then, one by one, they began to sing. The sound was soft at first, rising hesitantly from their parted lips, growing louder, until it filled the air around me. Their voices were thin, spectral, as if they came from somewhere far away, carried across the snow by forces unknown. It was Silent Night, but not as I had ever heard it before. The familiar melody twisted and warped, the notes skittering just out of reach, forming a song that was both sorrowful and grotesque. I wanted to cover my ears, to block out the sound, but I couldn't move. I stood frozen, held captive by their mournful choir. The singing grew louder, swelling into an almost overwhelming cacophony, and I felt something strange stir within me. A faint sense of recognition, as if the song were dredging up memories I'd buried long ago. Images flickered through my mind, disjointed and unclear. A hand reaching out, a voice calling my name, laughter that echoed through empty halls. They were fragments of moments I had tried to forget, memories of a childhood spent in lonely, silent rooms. And with each note of their song, the memories grew clearer, sharper, like shards of glass cutting through the fog in my mind. I realized, with a sinking dread, that I was beginning to hum along. The tune came unbidden, slipping from my lips as though it had always been there, buried deep within me, waiting to be summoned by the town's ghostly choir. My voice wavered, uncertain, but the figures only sang louder, drawing me into their strange, mournful hymn. Then, as if in answer to my quiet joining, the figures began to move. They swayed together, leaning toward me in unison, their hands outstretched, fingers grasping the cold air. It was like some twisted waltz, a macabre holiday dance, and I found myself swaying in time with them, drawn into their rhythm. The figures moved closer, forming a circle around me, their voices rising until they filled every corner of the empty street. The sound pressed against me, so loud it felt as though it were coming from within my own chest, reverberating through my bones. I was no longer an observer. I was part of their silent ritual, woven into the fabric of this strange, haunted town. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling, a thick, suffocating quiet that settled over us like a blanket of snow. I looked up, heart pounding, and saw that the figures had stopped moving. They stood still, their eyes fixed on me, waiting, expectant. The man in the Santa hat took a step forward, his gaze locking with mine. There was something in his expression, something that made my skin crawl. A sadness so deep it was almost unbearable, a sorrow that seemed to stretch beyond time. He held out his hand, as though offering me something. My gaze dropped to his palm, where a small, tattered envelope rested, addressed in shaky handwriting. The letters were faint, almost illegible, but I could just make out a name written there. My son's name. I staggered back, clutching the silver box to my chest. This couldn't be real. It was impossible. And yet, the envelope was there, as real as the snow beneath my feet, as real as the figures that surrounded me. With a trembling hand, I reached out and took the envelope. The paper was cold and brittle, crumbling slightly under my touch. I opened it, dreading what I might find. Inside was a single piece of paper, blank except for one line scrawled in faded ink. "He's waiting for you." A chill ran through me, colder than the snow, colder than the silent gaze of the figures that watched me. I looked up, and in that moment I understood. This town was a place of waiting, a place where forgotten souls lingered, bound by memories of the ones they had lost. And now I was part of it, a part of their silent, eternal vigil, a new addition to their ghostly congregation. The figures began to move again, turning away from me, returning to their silent, watchful positions along the street. They left me standing there, alone with the letter and the cold weight of understanding. I clutched the envelope and the silver box, knowing that I, too, was now bound to this place, tied to its endless, mournful song. And as I walked away, The strains of Silent Night began to drift through the air once more, faint and haunting, a lullaby for the lost. The silver box felt heavier in my hand as I clutched it, cold seeping through my gloves and into my bones. I couldn't look back at the street. I knew the figures would still be there, frozen in their positions, waiting for the next hapless soul to drift by and join their ranks. Their songs still lingered in my ears, pressing into the silence with a dreadful familiarity. Yet now, the silence seemed more menacing than their whispers, an echo that amplified the emptiness of the town around me. I forced myself to walk. My feet left shallow prints in the snow as I trudged down the narrow path leading from the street to what looked like an abandoned park. Branches of bare trees stretched overhead, gnarled and twisted as though the cold itself had frozen them mid-writhe. They seemed to form a canopy, a corridor that was both suffocating and strangely protective. I felt an urge to duck beneath them, as though some invisible threat were pressing down from the sky. The envelope weighed down my pocket, and I could feel it with every step, a constant reminder of the message it held. "He's waiting for you." I dared not say his name aloud, afraid that the very syllables would be swallowed up by the unfeeling cold, twisted into something I couldn't recognize. I had long accepted his absence, my guilt tucked away into the dark corners of my mind, but now it had resurfaced, raw and exposed. This place had dug it out, an old wound torn open. Ahead, I spotted a playground, swings dangling like ghostly figures in the still air, the seats half buried in the snow. The slide gleamed in the dim winter light, frost catching along its metal edges. It looked untouched, as though no child had ever dared to play there. The park was utterly silent, and yet I thought I heard something. A faint, echoing sound, like laughter. A child's laughter. My heart stilled. Couldn't be him. It was just the park, the eerie quiet and my own memories mingling to haunt me. But I felt an odd pull, a compulsion that urged me toward the playground. Each step seemed heavier, the snow thicker, as if the town itself were trying to hold me back. But I pressed on, past the swings and toward the slide, my breath shallow in the frigid air. As I approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, half buried at the base of the slide, was a small blue mitten. I recognized it instantly. It was one of his, the ones I had knitted myself, back when he was small and all his clothes seemed too thin, too inadequate against the winter winds. I knelt, my gloved hands brushing the snow away to reveal the mitten's mate beside it, nestled in the snow as if waiting to be found. My fingers trembled as I picked them up, the familiar wool rough against my touch. He'd worn them so many winters ago, his little hands clutching mine as we walked through the snow, laughing and chatting. Now they were here impossibly, like the note, like everything else in this twisted town. And then I heard it, a faint voice, soft and distant, calling from somewhere beyond the playground. It was a child's voice, warm and familiar, calling out a single word, "Dad." I rose, the mittens clutched in my hands, and looked around. There was no one in sight, only the empty park and the shadows cast by the leafless trees. But the voice sounded again, closer this time, echoing through the silence. It was unmistakable. His voice, the voice I had convinced myself I would never hear again. It was a voice I had both longed for and dreaded in equal measure. An impossible, heartbreaking sound that made my chest tighten. "Dad," my throat closed, and my feet moved of their own accord, carrying me toward the sound. I moved through the park and into a small, winding path lined with snow-dusted benches and frozen shrubs. The path twisted and turned, leading deeper into the heart of the town, where the shadows grew thicker, darker, as though they had substance and weight. The voice called again, and I followed, my every step echoing in the silence. The air felt colder here, sharper, slicing through my jacket and into my skin. The houses on either side of the path seemed to loom over me, their windows dark and unseeing, like the eyes of indifferent giants watching a man descend into madness. And then there he was. He stood in the middle of the path, his small figure barely visible in the dim light, his face half hidden in shadow. He wore the same winter coat I remembered, the red one with the missing button on the collar. His head was tilted slightly, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. It was as though he was waiting, watching, just as the townspeople had done. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I was frozen, staring at him, unable to speak, unable to move. It was him, impossibly, undeniably him. And yet, there was something wrong, something off in the way he stood, too still, too silent, like a photograph brought to life. I managed to whisper his name, my voice choked and trembling. Jack. He didn't respond, didn't move. He just stared, his eyes dark and unblinking. And then, slowly, he reached out his hand, as though inviting me to join him, to take his hand and follow him into whatever shadowed realm he had come from. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, my mind screaming for me to stop. But I couldn't resist him, couldn't turn away. He was my son, my lost boy, returned to me at last. All the fear, all the dread melted away, leaving only a desperate, aching need to hold him, to touch him, to feel the warmth of his hand in mine. I reached out, our fingers just inches apart, the air between us humming with a strange electric tension. And then, as my hand brushed his, he vanished. I was left standing alone in the path, my hand extended into empty air, my heart echoing in the cold, indifferent silence. The town around me seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker, as though mocking me, as though laughing at my desperate, foolish hope. I fell to my knees, clutching the empty space where he had been, my breath hitching in short, ragged gasps. The mittens slipped from my hands and fell into the snow, and I watched them, half buried, half forgotten, just as he was. The town had given him to me only to take him away again, to remind me that he was gone, that he had always been gone, and that I would never escape the weight of that loss. And as I knelt there, the voice came again, soft and faint, drifting through the darkness like a cruel, haunting lullaby. Dad, the town was calling, whispering his name, and I knew then that I would never leave this place. The call of Dad seemed to follow me as I stumbled back through the empty park, my steps uncertain, my breath rising in plumes that quickly vanished into the cold air. Each time I looked back, expecting to see a glimpse of him, there was nothing but the hollow landscape, bleached by winter. I told myself it was only the wind, a trick of memory, but I knew better. This town had a way of burrowing inside, wrapping itself around memories and refusing to let go. And, in my heart, I knew this place wanted something from me. I arrived back at the old inn, its once welcoming door now looking more like a trap. The wind had picked up, shrieking against the thin glass panes as if urging me back out. Yet, within the inn, the cold seemed to settle even deeper, filling the silence with an eerie stillness. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the empty corridors like an unwelcome greeting. Inside, everything seemed unchanged, still holding that odd warmth of a place suspended in time. But as I moved down the hallway toward my room, I saw something waiting for me. There, in front of my door, was a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. My name was written across the top in neat, looping letters, the ink faded and smudged. The handwriting looked familiar, heartbreakingly so. I didn't dare open it there in the hallway. The silence around me felt too expectant, like something was watching, waiting for me to act. Instead, I carried it into the room and shut the door behind me, trying to shut out the gnawing sense that I was not alone. I sat on the edge of the bed, turning the package over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the roughness of the twine. Every nerve in my body urged caution, yet my hands moved almost of their own accord, pulling at the string and peeling back the paper. Inside, wrapped carefully in old tissue, was a small book, bound in dark leather. I recognized it instantly. It was Jack's journal, the one he'd used to scribble his thoughts and sketches in, his clumsy attempts at spelling out his dreams. The cover was slightly worn, the edges frayed, but it was unmistakably his. I hadn't seen it since he disappeared. How it had found its way here, to this town, to this very room, I couldn't begin to imagine. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as I opened it, the pages crackling slightly with age. The first page was just as I remembered it. His name written in blocky letters, his drawing of a tree and a house beside it. But as I turned the pages, I saw something new, something I knew hadn't been there before. The entries grew darker, the handwriting shakier, as though something had crept into his thoughts, casting shadows over his words. "I don't like the dark," one entry read. "Sometimes I see him watching me." My breath caught. I had never known him to fear the dark, not my fearless Jack. I turned another page, and another, each entry seeming to spiral deeper, the words fragmenting, becoming jumbled. The drawings, once so innocent, took on an eerie quality. They were crude and childlike, but something about them struck me with a chill. A figure looming over a bed, dark eyes peering from a closet, the outline of a man hidden behind the trees. The final page was blank, save for a single word scrawled hastily in the center: waiting. As I stared at the word, I felt a strange heaviness settle over me, a sense of being trapped, as though the very room had closed in. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and deepen, reaching out to touch the edge of the bed, the walls pressing closer, suffocating. I tried to push it away, to shake off the growing dread, but it clung to me, a stubborn fog I couldn't escape. Suddenly, a loud knock echoed through the room, sharp and commanding. I looked up, heart hammering, expecting to see what? Some lost fragment of the past? But the door was closed, the hallway silent. The knock came again, insistent this time. I rose, slowly, feeling a cold sweat prickle along my spine. With a trembling hand, I reached for the door handle, half expecting the figure from Jack's drawings to be on the other side, his face hidden in shadows, waiting. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. A stillness settled over it that seemed almost unnatural. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though some invisible presence lingered just beyond sight. I stepped back, half closing the door, my hands still resting on the handle as I scanned the shadows. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement at the end of the hall, a figure half shrouded in darkness, standing perfectly still. It was tall, its outline barely visible in the dim light, yet unmistakably there, a looming shape that seemed to watch me with a silent, eerie patience. I blinked, and it was gone. I closed the door, leaning against it as though that flimsy barrier could protect me from whatever was haunting this place. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Every instinct told me to leave, to flee this strange, forsaken town and never look back. But something stronger held me here, a thread of guilt and longing that refused to break. As I slumped onto the bed, Jack's journal slipped from my hands and fell open once more. The final page lay exposed, the word waiting stark against the yellowed paper. The journal lay open on my lap, its pages shivering slightly as though in response to an unseen breeze. The single word waiting seemed to pulse on the page, drawing me in, yet pushing me back, as if it carried a weight beyond what ink and paper should bear. I found myself staring at it, mesmerized, unable to turn away. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the old glass window with a fierceness that seemed to mock the stillness of the room. I told myself that it was just a word, a fragment of a child's imagination, but a nagging sense deep within me argued otherwise. Jack had written it, that much was certain, but not in the innocent, clumsy handwriting I remembered. This word was different, more urgent, more haunted. Felt like a warning, a reminder. But of what? I ran a finger over the ink, now faded but unmistakably real. Just as I was about to close the journal, something strange happened. The old leather cover grew warm under my touch, almost uncomfortably so, as if the book itself was alive, as if it was breathing. And then I heard it, the faintest whisper, soft as the wind but distinctly a voice. Dad, it was his voice, no more than a breath, yet it carried 1,000 memories in its fragile murmur. It wasn't the warm, excited voice I remembered, but something muted, drained. My heart clenched, a deep ache settling in my chest as I listened, desperate for another word, a phrase, anything to hold on to. Dad, don't forget. The voice dissolved into the faint rustling of the wind outside, and I sat there, chilled to the bone, feeling the grip of fear tighten around my heart. My mind wrestled with explanations, straining for something rational, but every thought slipped away, leaving only the echo of his voice reverberating in the empty room. I looked around, half expecting to see his small figure in the shadows, a fleeting image like the ones in the journal. Instead, there was only the stark, silent room, as though nothing had ever happened. Yet, the silence felt denser, more insistent, as if daring me to believe that I hadn't heard it, that my mind was merely playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that voice was real. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me with an invisible weight, and the shadows around me seemed to stretch, growing darker, almost alive in their reach. I shut the journal quickly, clutching it to my chest like a shield. The walls felt too close, the windows too narrow, as if the room itself was folding inward, trapping me in. I forced myself to breathe, to shake off the unnatural feeling pressing in on all sides. I rose from the bed, placing the journal carefully on the nightstand, half fearing what might happen if I opened it again. My own footsteps seemed loud, echoing strangely as I paced the small space, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. But the silence, now darker, more absolute, seemed to have a voice of its own, whispering doubts into my mind, feeding on my growing fear. It was then I noticed something peculiar, a faint scratch on the wall, just above the nightstand, like the trace of a nail dragged across plaster. I leaned in, squinting to make it out, feeling a strange pull that urged me closer. The scratch wasn't just random. It looked deliberate, almost purposeful. I reached out to touch it, running my fingers over the rough groove. As I did, the air shifted, as though a draft had entered the room, chilling me to my core. The scratch seemed to vibrate under my fingertips, and a wave of nausea swept over me. It was as if the wall itself held something, some remnant of a memory or an intention that lingered just beyond the surface. My hand recoiled, but the cold sensation lingered, as if the touch had branded itself into my skin. The wind outside rose to a fever pitch, shrieking through the trees, and a sound echoed within it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like small footsteps pacing through the hallway. They grew louder, echoing down the corridor, coming closer, until they stopped abruptly outside my door. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for the knock. But there was only silence. A silence that felt alive, pulsing, thick with expectation. And then, in the faintest of whispers, I heard it again, almost lost in the wind. "Dad, don't forget." I backed away from the door, feeling a creeping dread that I couldn't shake, a sense that something beyond my understanding was unfolding, as if the town, this room, had been waiting for me all along. The wind outside died down, leaving only a low, ghostly hum that seemed to seep through the walls, filling the room with a strange, otherworldly sound. It was then I realized that this place, this town, was not simply haunted. It was holding something, keeping it, binding it, and somehow, some terrible part of me knew it would never let me go. The next morning, the world felt somehow blunted, as if the colors had faded and every sound was muffled by an invisible fog. I moved through the small kitchen with a kind of dreamlike detachment, my eyes flicking back to the hallway now and again, half expecting to see that ghostly scratch mark spreading itself across the walls. A part of me wondered if the strange encounter with Jack's voice, the warmth of the journal, was nothing more than a trick of the mind, a byproduct of too many sleepless nights. Yet the feeling remained, a quiet but insistent weight that pressed down on me, keeping me alert, afraid to linger too long in any one room. After breakfast, I took a walk around the town, hoping to clear my head, to pull myself back into reality. The air was crisp and damp, tinged with the scent of wood smoke, and a fog lay low across the roads, clinging to the earth like something alive. The town itself was as I remembered, the narrow streets lined with quiet shops and houses, their windows dark and uninviting, as though the entire place had been abandoned. As I walked, I felt eyes on me, a sensation that grew sharper with each step. Now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the periphery of my vision, a curtain twitching, a figure darting out of sight behind a lamppost. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there, only the strange, pervasive silence, punctuated by the echo of my own footsteps. It was as I neared the edge of town, near the grove of twisted, blackened trees, that I saw the house again. Its silhouette loomed in the distance, stark against the fog, its windows dark and watchful. It seemed more like a shadow than a structure, a part of the landscape that had grown there out of the earth itself. The sight of it filled me with an inexplicable dread, as if a part of me already knew that this place held answers I wasn't ready to confront. Drawn by a morbid curiosity, I found myself walking towards it, my feet moving of their own accord. The closer I got, the more oppressive the air became, thick and icy, with a peculiar smell of damp earth and decay. The house seemed to breathe, each creak of its old boards a groan of something ancient and weary. A broken path led to the front steps, and I climbed them slowly, one hand resting on the worn, splintered rail. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for me, I pushed it open, and it swung inward with a low, groaning sound, revealing a dimly lit hallway that stretched into darkness. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, the heavy silence pressing in on all sides. Dust floated in the weak shafts of light, suspended in the air like tiny specters. The house smelled of mildew and something else, something sharp and metallic, like old blood. The rooms were empty, each one colder than the last, and I wandered through them in a daze, a strange sense of familiarity tugging at me. It was as if I had been here before, though I knew that was impossible. I passed by a faded photograph on the wall, its glass cracked, the image barely visible beneath the grime. It showed a family, parents and 2 children, standing stiffly in front of the house. Their faces were shadowed, their expressions blank, and yet something about the little boy in the picture sent a chill down my spine. His face, though blurred, bore an uncanny resemblance to Jack. The silence grew heavier, more charged, as I continued through the house. I could almost feel the walls closing in, their age and decay pressing down on me like a weight. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard it again, the faintest whisper, carried through the cold, stale air. "Dad." The voice was clearer this time, closer, as though it was coming from the very walls. My hands shook as I moved toward the sound, my steps echoing in the hollow space. I followed the voice down a narrow, winding hallway that seemed to stretch on endlessly, its walls covered in peeling wallpaper that bore strange, dark stains. At the end of the hallway was a door, slightly ajar, its paint flaking away in brittle pieces. I pushed it open, holding my breath, and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a small, battered chest sitting in the corner. The air was so cold that I could see my breath, each exhale forming a thin mist that hung in the air before fading. I approached the chest slowly, feeling the weight of every step. My hand trembled as I reached for the lid, hesitating before lifting it. Inside, I found a small pile of objects. A broken toy car, a faded book with half the pages missing, a single shoe, and a lock of hair tied with a frayed ribbon. These were the relics of a child's life, each one worn and abandoned, like remnants of someone who had been forgotten. My heart ached as I looked at them, an unbearable sadness settling over me. And then I noticed something else. A small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath the objects. I unfolded it carefully, my hands trembling, and read the words written in a child's scrawl. "Please don't forget me." The room grew colder, the air thick with an almost tangible sadness, as if the walls themselves were mourning. I stood there, clutching the note, feeling a despair that went beyond words. I wanted to scream, to tear down the walls, to run from this place and never look back. But I was frozen, trapped in the grip of something that held me fast, something old and relentless, something that would not let me go until I understood. And then, in the silence, I heard the voice again, softer this time, a fading echo that drifted through the empty house like a final plea. "Dad, don't forget." The house seemed to close in around me, pressing with an ancient weight that made it hard to breathe. The tiny, haunted voice calling "Dad" still echoed in my ears as I clutched the note. I couldn't bring myself to let go of it, though my hands shook with a kind of dread I hadn't felt before, something deeper and older than fear. It was as though every shadowed corner of the house bore witness to something dreadful, and every wall held memories it would never reveal. I turned to leave the room, but the air felt thicker, as if the house was somehow holding me there, demanding something of me I couldn't give. The thought came, unbidden and unwelcome, that perhaps this place didn't want me to leave, that it had waited a long time for someone to remember, to carry its secrets out into the world. As I moved through the hallway, the house seemed to whisper, not in words but in subtle, creeping sounds. The faint creak of a board, a settling of dust, the low groan of a door shifting slightly on its own. It felt alive in a way that houses shouldn't, as if it was aware of me and everything I was doing. The shadows deepened, reaching out along the floor, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me, tracking my every move. Halfway down the hallway, I felt a chill spread across my neck, a tingling coldness like an icy finger tracing along my skin. The urge to run nearly overtook me, but something stronger, something terrible, kept me rooted. I needed to understand. I needed to know what had happened here, why the house had called to me, why it clung to memories of a child's life. I found myself in the main parlor again, standing in front of an ancient, tarnished mirror hung over the fireplace. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it drew my attention with an almost magnetic pull. The glass was cracked and fogged, its silvering faded, yet in the dim light, I could make out my own reflection, pale and ghostly. But as I stared, I noticed something else. A second shape, faint and transparent, standing just behind me. It was the figure of a child, small and thin. His features blurred yet unmistakably familiar. His eyes were wide, dark, and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to reach through the glass. I couldn't turn around. I could only stare into the mirror, meeting his gaze, feeling that strange ache again, that terrible sense of loss. "Dad," the boy's voice echoed, as faint as a sigh. His lips didn't move, but the word filled the air around me, a plea that seemed to seep into my bones. I wanted to respond, to reach out and somehow hold on to him, to tell him that he wasn't forgotten, that I would remember him even if no one else could. But as I raised my hand, the image began to fade, the boy's form dissolving into the shadows of the room. In a desperate, instinctual moment, I reached out and touched the cold glass of the mirror, as if somehow I could hold on to him. But my fingers met only the cracked, lifeless surface, and in that instant, I understood. I hadn't just wandered into this house. I had been summoned. The boy was gone, but the house remained, holding his memories, trapping his voice in its dark, endless halls. I stumbled back, feeling suddenly lightheaded, as though I'd been drained. The note was still in my hand, its edges worn and soft from time. The words, "Please don't forget me," burned in my mind, and I knew that I couldn't leave. Not yet. The house wouldn't allow it. Slowly, I made my way back toward the entrance, hoping for a reprieve, a breath of the cold, clean air outside. But as I reached the door, I found it locked, the knob unyielding beneath my hand. I tugged and twisted, panic clawing at me, but the door remained firmly shut, as though sealed by some invisible force. And then, just as I felt the walls beginning to close in, I heard a soft, slow creak, as if someone were walking up the stairs in the hallway behind me. The sound was deliberate, each step echoing through the silence, growing louder, closer. I turned, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. The staircase was empty, but the footsteps continued, as if someone unseen was making their way toward me. The sensation of being watched returned, sharper and more focused, and I knew with a dread certainty that I was no longer alone. I stood frozen, staring up the shadowy staircase. The footsteps had stopped, but the air in the house seemed to shiver, thickening around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there. A presence, maybe the house itself, watching and waiting. With no other options, I forced myself up the stairs, each step slow, deliberate, as though moving too quickly might stir whatever lay in the dark. The house creaked in response, groaning softly beneath me, as if under the weight of an unspeakable history. I felt that I was treading not just on the stairs but on layers of memory, of lost time, as if with every step, I was descending deeper into the past. At the top, I turned down a narrow hallway that led to a single door at the end, slightly ajar. I had no memory of seeing this door before, and something about its darkened outline filled me with dread. But I felt that strange, undeniable pull, as though the house itself was guiding me, urging me forward, leading me toward a revelation I wasn't sure I wanted. I reached for the door, fingers trembling, and pushed it open. Inside was a small, dust-choked room. It was bare, save for a small bed in the corner and a cracked, dusty window that let in a weak shaft of afternoon light. The air was stale, carrying with it a faint, sour smell, like mildew and something older, something decaying. On the bed lay a worn, tattered book. I crossed the room, feeling that same inexplicable compulsion. When I picked it up, dust scattered into the air, and the spine crackled under my fingers. It was a journal, small and faded, the pages fraying at the edges. Inside, the handwriting was small and neat, childlike, and as I read the first line, a chill gripped me. Today Dad didn't come again. My breath caught, and I felt a hollow ache stir inside me, a familiar sadness I couldn't place. I turned the page. Sometimes I think he's forgotten about me. The house is quiet. I hear things at night. Maybe it's him, or maybe it's something else. The words were simple, childlike, but they carried a depth of sorrow that felt ancient, worn into the bones of this house. I read on, each entry filling me with a growing unease, as if I was somehow intruding on memories that had lain buried for too long. I try to be good so he'll come back, but the shadows in the hallways grow longer every day. Sometimes I think they're alive. They watch me. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, the silence thickening around me. The handwriting grew shakier, the entries shorter, each one filled with a deeper sense of dread, a growing fear that seeped from the pages. He's never coming back, is he? I don't belong here. The house wants me. I slammed the journal shut, the last line echoing in my mind. The house wants me. I felt a strange dizziness, as though the floor were tilting beneath my feet. I glanced around, feeling as if I'd disturbed something ancient, something that had been waiting. The door behind me creaked closed with a slow, deliberate groan. I was alone in the room, the weak light from the window casting strange, elongated shadows. My own face reflected faintly in the glass, pale and strained. And then, slowly, I realized that there was another reflection beside mine. A small figure, the child I'd seen in the mirror downstairs. He stood there, his expression hollow and sad, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. Dad, his voice was soft, so soft I could barely hear it. Yet it seemed to fill the entire room, echoing off the walls, settling into every dark corner. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words caught in my throat, and I felt a deep, aching guilt bloom within me. I'm here, I whispered, almost against my will. But the boy didn't move, his gaze unwavering. The air felt thick and cold, pressing in on me, and I understood with dreadful clarity that he wasn't looking at me but through me, as if seeing something or someone else entirely. I took a step back, but the room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in, the floor tilting slightly, as though the house itself was shifting, breathing, swallowing me whole. The shadows seemed to gather, deepening, reaching out toward me with fingers of darkness. And in the silence, I heard his voice again, softer this time, fading but insistent. "Please don't forget me." As the room dimmed, I stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape. I twisted the knob, pushing against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The house had sealed itself around me, holding me captive in its endless, echoing silence. And then, just as panic began to claw at me, I heard footsteps again, slow and heavy, coming down the hallway toward me. The footsteps echoed, one after another, like the beat of a dark, steady pulse. I pressed myself against the door, breath hitching as I realized the presence coming toward me wasn't in a hurry. It moved slowly, deliberately, savoring each step, as though it knew I had nowhere else to go. I felt the weight of all the house's history press in on me, and a single terrible thought settled in my mind. The house remembered. It remembered every soul that had ever wandered its halls, every child who had been forgotten, every spirit that had been trapped within its walls. I was one of them now, part of the house's story, woven into the fabric of its endless, pulsing memories. With no other choice, I turned back toward the room. The small figure still hovered in the shadows by the window, watching me with those sad, empty eyes. He lifted his hand slowly, as if in a gesture of farewell, but I couldn't look away. It was then that I realized why he seemed so familiar. This wasn't some forgotten child. The face was my own, hollowed out, a reflection twisted by the years I'd spent in guilt and denial, the time lost with my own family, my own children. This place wasn't a haunted house. It was my memory, my sorrow, brought to life. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and I felt a terrible calm settle over me. There was no escaping this. I was here because I had always been here. I was part of this house, this place of endless echoes. With one last look at the boy in the window, I closed my eyes, letting go of everything I thought I knew about who I was and where I'd been. The room dissolved around me, fading into shadows, and in that final moment, I heard the house whisper, a soft, terrible sigh of acceptance. When I opened my eyes, the room was empty. The house was silent, and I knew that I would be here forever.